Metrojet Flight 9268. On an otherwise ordinary autumn morning in 2015, a Russian passenger plane, Metrojet Flight 9268, took off from a resort town in Egypt heading for St. Petersburg. On board were 224 people, most of them tourists returning from vacation, including 25 children. The flight crew, all Russians, had extensive experience, and the aircraft itself, an Airbus A321, had logged tens of thousands of flight hours. But just 23 minutes into the flight, something went terribly wrong. The plane suddenly vanished from radar screens while cruising at an altitude of over 30,000 feet, leaving behind a debris field scattered across 8 square miles in the Sinai Peninsula. News of the incident was initially met with a flurry of conflicting information. The pilot had supposedly made a distress call, but this was later proven false by analysis of the flight recorders. The plane was reported to have split in two, with some initial and ultimately incorrect reports suggesting that survivors could be heard. The most chilling detail, however, emerged from the investigation itself. An analysis of the cockpit voice recorder revealed a sudden, loud noise just before the recording cut off. This discovery, combined with a US satellite detecting a heat flash in the area at the time of the crash, led investigators to a terrifying conclusion. A bomb had detonated on board. Eventually, Russia's Federal Security Service confirmed the finding, stating that an improvised explosive device containing the equivalent of up to 2.2 pounds of TNT was responsible for the tragedy. The Islamic State's Sinai branch claimed responsibility for the attack, even publishing photos of the bomb they said was hidden in a soda can. The disaster had a devastating ripple effect. In the immediate aftermath, several countries, including the United States, United Kingdom, and Ireland, suspended flights from Sharm el-Sheikh. Russia grounded all flights to Egypt entirely, a suspension that would last for years. The airline, Metrojet, eventually went bankrupt. Germanwings Flight 9525. On a seemingly ordinary morning in March 2015, a Germanwings flight took off from Barcelona, Spain, bound for Düsseldorf, Germany. The passenger manifest included 144 people and a crew of 6. Among them were 16 high school students and their 2 teachers on their way home from a student exchange trip. Tragically, this flight would never reach its destination. Just 26 minutes behind schedule, the Airbus A320 climbed to its cruising altitude of 38,000 feet. But as it crossed the French coastline, something unthinkable happened. While the captain was out of the cockpit, the first officer, Andreas Lubitz, locked the door, leaving him unable to get back in. The plane began a rapid, controlled descent into the French Alps. Its path, a chilling red line on a radar screen tracing its final, fatal seconds. Audible on the cockpit voice recorder were the harrowing sounds of the captain desperately trying to re-enter, banging on the reinforced cockpit door, but it was to no avail. Meanwhile, air traffic controllers tried to contact the plane, but received no response. All that could be heard from inside the cockpit was the sound of Lubitz's calm, steady breathing. After about 10 minutes, the plane, traveling at over 400 miles per hour, slammed into a mountain, instantly killing all 150 people on board. Investigators would later discover that Lubitz had a history of severe depression and suicidal thoughts, and had researched suicide methods and cockpit door security online in the days leading up to the crash. Although he had been deemed unfit to work by his doctors, he concealed this from his employer and reported for duty, turning a routine flight into a tragic act of murder-suicide. The aftermath of this disaster saw some airlines adopt a temporary rule requiring 2 crew members in the cockpit at all times, a policy that has since been discontinued. PIA Flight 8303. It was a Friday in May 2020, and the world was in the grip of the COVID-19 pandemic. People were anxious to get home, especially with the Eid al-Fitr holiday fast approaching. Among them were the passengers of Pakistan International Airlines Flight 8303, a domestic flight from Lahore to Karachi. On board were 91 passengers and 8 crew, including a well-known model and the CEO of a major bank. The flight was just minutes from its destination, Jinnah International Airport, when things started to go terribly wrong. The Airbus A320 was approaching the runway far too high and too fast. Air traffic control, noticing the dangerous descent, repeatedly offered the pilots a chance to go around and try a safer approach. But the crew, displaying a startling overconfidence, dismissed the warnings. One pilot was even heard saying to the other, "He will be surprised what we have done," seemingly proud of their risky maneuver. Without landing gear extended, the plane slammed onto the runway, scraping its engines against the asphalt. This was a catastrophic mistake. The friction and impact caused severe damage, and the pilots, realizing their error, attempted a desperate go-around. As the plane climbed away from the runway, both engines began to fail. The pilot in command of the flight, the more experienced of the two, had taken over the controls but seemed unable to recover. He was not the designated pilot flying. The engines, starved of oil from the damage they sustained, lost all power. The aircraft, now essentially a glider, lost altitude and airspeed. A mayday call was sent out, but it was too late. With no power, the plane plummeted into a residential neighborhood just short of the airport. The impact and subsequent fire destroyed several houses, killing 1 person on the ground and 97 of the people on board. Only 2 passengers survived the crash. The final report revealed that the pilot's casual conversation and disregard for standard safety procedures were the primary cause of this unimaginable tragedy. LATAM Airlines Peru Flight 2213. In an event that shocked the aviation world, a seemingly routine takeoff at Jorge Chávez International Airport in Lima, Peru, became a scene of fiery chaos. On November 18, 2022, LATAM Airlines Flight 2213, an Airbus A320neo, was accelerating down the runway when, without warning, a fire engine on an emergency drill crossed its path. A chilling video from the scene shows the split-second impact, with the aircraft's right engine ripped from its wing and the right landing gear collapsing. The plane careened down the runway, its right side engulfed in flames, before coming to a stop 8,200 feet from where the initial collision occurred. This harrowing incident, which resulted in the first ever hull loss of an A320neo, was a textbook example of how communication failures can lead to disaster. The aircraft's pilots had received clearance from air traffic control for their takeoff. At the same time, the fire engine crew operating on a poorly coordinated emergency drill mistakenly believed their own clearance permitted them to cross the active runway. The 2 clearances were issued just a minute apart. The investigation revealed that air traffic controllers had been notified of the drill only an hour beforehand and were operating with limited information. Compounding the problem, the communication between the controllers and the emergency responders used non-standard terminology, adding to the confusion. The tragic fallout of this communication breakdown was immense. 2 firefighters were killed in the initial collision, and a third, who was severely injured, passed away 7 months later. On the plane, all 108 occupants survived, but 40 people were injured, 4 seriously. In a controversial move, the aircraft's pilots were arrested and detained for 24 hours, immediately following the accident. A decision that drew sharp criticism from the Global Pilots Association, which argued such actions are detrimental to safety investigations. The final report ultimately concluded that the crash was the result of the emergency vehicles entering the runway without permission due to the poor planning and coordination of the drill. EgyptAir Flight 804. The story of EgyptAir Flight 804 is a perplexing tale of a routine journey that ended in disaster, leaving more questions than answers. The Airbus A320 took off from Paris, France, on a clear May night in 2016, heading for Cairo, Egypt, with 66 people on board. The trip was uneventful until the aircraft vanished from radar screens over the Mediterranean Sea at 2:33 a.m. What happened in those final moments has been a source of intense debate, with investigators from different countries reaching wildly different conclusions. Just minutes before the plane disappeared, a series of automated messages were sent from the aircraft indicating that smoke had been detected in the lavatory and in a crucial electronics bay near the cockpit. Adding to the mystery, Greek officials reported that the plane made a sudden, inexplicable series of sharp turns, a 90-degree turn to the left, followed by a 360-degree turn to the right, before plummeting 37,000 feet. Egyptian authorities initially denied this, but later confirmed the dramatic movements, which air safety experts said could have pushed the aircraft beyond its structural limits. The search for the wreckage was a multinational effort, and nearly a month later, the crucial flight recorders were recovered from the ocean floor. The data retrieved from the black boxes and the physical evidence from the wreckage only deepened the divide between investigators. Egyptian officials concluded that a fire, possibly caused by an explosion in the galley, was to blame. In contrast, French investigators believed the most likely cause was a fire in the cockpit, potentially ignited by an improperly set oxygen mask or even a pilot's cigarette. The case of EgyptAir Flight 804 remains a stark reminder that even with advanced technology and meticulous investigation, some secrets of the sky may forever be lost to the sea. Indonesia AirAsia Flight 8501. On a seemingly routine Airbus A320 carrying 162 people, known as Indonesia AirAsia Flight 8501, vanished from radar on its way from Indonesia to Singapore. The flight was normal until a small but persistent issue with the plane's rudder control system began to act up. This wasn't a new problem. In fact, the same electrical fault had triggered warnings over 20 times in the preceding year. On this particular flight, the captain tried to fix it as they had done before, by resetting the flight computers. This worked the first 3 times, but on the 4th occurrence, something went terribly wrong. Frustrated by the reoccurring warning, the captain took a drastic step and went against the standard procedure. He pulled a circuit breaker for the flight computers, unintentionally disconnecting the autopilot and other crucial flight controls. Within seconds, the plane began to bank sharply, catching the first officer off guard. In a moment of panic and disorientation, he overcorrected, pulling back on his side stick control and setting the aircraft into a steep 38,500-foot climb. The captain, in a moment of confusion, gave a contradictory command, and the two pilots' opposing inputs on their side sticks effectively canceled each other out. This left the plane in a stalled nose-up position, plunging from the sky at a terrifying rate. The aircraft plummeted into the Java Sea, killing everyone on board. The final report revealed that this small electrical fault, combined with the pilot's unapproved attempt to fix it, created a perfect storm of human error and technical malfunction, leading to a tragic end. The bodies of the 46 victims were never found, and in the end, it was a small, non-critical malfunction that led to an unimaginable disaster. Japan Airlines Flight 516. On a frigid January night in Tokyo, the calm rhythm of Haneda Airport shattered in seconds. Japan Airlines Flight 516, a gleaming Airbus A350 with 379 souls on board, descended for what should have been an unremarkable landing. At the same moment, a Japan Coast Guard Dash 8 laden with emergency supplies for quake-stricken regions moved across the same runway. The collision was sudden, violent, and devastating. Flames swallowed both aircraft, and thick black smoke curled into the night sky. 5 of the 6 Coast Guard crew members perished instantly. Yet against the odds, every passenger and crew member aboard the A350 escaped with their lives. The captain crew became the lifeline, voices rising above the chaos, shouting orders and wielding megaphones when the public address system failed. Passengers obeyed without hesitation, abandoning carry-ons, sliding into the cold night air. 11 minutes. That's all it took to empty a burning wide-body jet, a feat aviation experts will study for years. The aftermath rippled far beyond the charred runway. Haneda, Japan's busiest gateway, ground to an almost complete halt during the peak New Year travel surge. Over 1,200 flights vanished from schedules, stranding more than 220,000 travelers. Rail operators scrambled to fill the gaps, rolling out extra high-speed trains to keep the nation moving. For Japan Airlines, the financial blow was brutal. The loss of a 2-year-old A350 valued at $105 million. The investigation peeled back the layers. Air traffic control had cleared Flight 516 to land and instructed the Coast Guard plane to hold position. Somewhere in the exchanges, the phrase "number one" may have sown fatal confusion, leading the Dash 8's pilot to believe entry onto the runway was authorized. Controllers, distracted by other traffic, failed to notice the incursion. Swift reforms followed: new staffing, tighter protocols, and the ban of that ambiguous phrase, too late to save that quiet Tokyo night from turning into a moment etched in aviation history. Tibet Airlines Flight 9833. The morning of May 12, 2022 at Chongqing Jianbei International Airport began like countless others, until Tibet Airlines Flight 9833, an Airbus A319 bound for Nanking, thundered down the runway and met disaster before even leaving the ground. Pilots, sensing an abnormality during takeoff, slammed the brakes, but momentum carried the jet off the tarmac. Both engines tore away, and flames erupted near the nose. In seconds, black smoke curled upwards as 122 people scrambled for their lives. Every passenger and crew member made it out alive, though 36 suffered minor injuries in the frantic evacuation. The image of a charred fuselage against the concrete stood as a reminder of how quickly the ordinary can tip into chaos. This particular A319, just a decade old, had accumulated over 28,000 flight hours and nearly 14,500 takeoff and landing cycles. On paper, it was a reliable machine, but reliability faltered, not in the hardware, but in the cockpit. The investigation, concluded in June 2024, laid blame squarely on crew error. The Civil Aviation Authority of China responded with sharp consequences: a $123,000 fine against Tibet Airlines, salary cuts of up to 40% for top executives, and the revocation of both captains' and co-captains' licenses. The first officer faced a 6-month suspension. What might have been a headline for tragedy instead became one of improbable survival, but the cost was still staggering. Beyond the destroyed aircraft, there was reputational damage, regulatory scrutiny, and the uncomfortable truth that human misjudgment, more than mechanical failure, can turn a routine takeoff into a fiery escape. In the end, Flight 9833 left no coffins to fill, but it left scars in boardrooms, flight decks, and the memories of those who slid down the evacuation chutes that morning with the smell of burning jet fuel in the air. Sichuan Airlines Flight 8633. At 6:25 a.m. on May 14, 2018, Sichuan Airlines Flight 8633 lifted off from Chongqing bound for the thin air of Lhasa. The Airbus A319 carried 128 souls, including Captain Liu Chuanjian, a former Air Force instructor with over 11,000 hours in the sky. About 40 minutes later, cruising at 30,000 feet over Sichuan's mountains, the calm was ripped apart, literally. The right front windshield panel tore away from the fuselage, triggering an explosive decompression. The cockpit roared with deafening wind. Communication became nearly impossible. The flight control unit took damage, and First Officer Xu Ruhichin was nearly sucked entirely out of the plane, saved only by his seatbelt. He sustained facial injuries, an eye wound, and a sprained wrist. Flight Attendant Zhou Yawen also suffered a wrist injury. Despite the gaping cockpit exposure, Airbus's insulation kept the passenger cabin temperature from plummeting, sparing travelers from frostbite. Descending to the safe 8,000-foot mark wasn't an option. The terrain below was too high, so the crew wrestled the overweight jet toward Chengdu Shuangliu International Airport. After 35 tense minutes, they touched down at 7:42 a.m., the brakes fighting to halt the heavier-than-normal aircraft. The Civil Aviation Administration of China's investigation traced the disaster to a damaged seal on the windshield, which allowed moisture to seep into the heating system. Over time, the insulation degraded, sparking electrical arcs that generated enough heat to shatter the double-layered glass. The cockpit door, designed to equalize pressure, blew open mid-crisis, tripping 17 circuit breakers and crippling several systems. In the aftermath, the crew was celebrated nationwide, with Liu receiving an award of about $720,000. The aircraft was repaired and returned to service, and the harrowing ordeal inspired the 2019 film The Captain and a feature on Mayday. Against all odds, every single person on board walked away alive.